We talked about some of the typical activities of a user experience professional. Now let's dig in a little more on a related topic, which is the different kinds of UX roles that are out there. So it is possible for one person to do all of those activities that I described, doing the research, doing the design, doing the testing, and so on. But it's also possible that that work gets broken up into a number of different roles. So whether you are someone who is looking for candidates to fill a particular role, or whether you are interested in being a UX professional, it's useful, I think, to understand what kinds of roles are typically out there, and what you'll find when you're looking for a job, or the kinds of candidates you're likely to get if you're posting for a job. So as I said, it is possible for a UX professional to do all the things that I talked about. Sometimes we talk about that as being a generalist. But it's also possible that this gets broken up. So a real common role is something called a UX researcher. And so that encompasses the research part that we were talking about. But, there's not standardization in terms of what user research means either. Sometimes when people talk about, oh, this is a UX research role, they're talking about the upfront research that we've mentioned, like interviewing users or observing users, or interviewing stakeholders. So all of that kind of upfront work, perhaps identifying the ideal task flow for a user to do, perhaps mapping out what the users do now. All of those things are considered upfront research. And sometimes a UX researcher role implies all of that upfront work. But sometimes when people say UX researcher, they are also talking about research that goes on during design and after design. So they're talking about testing, and there's all different kinds of testing. You can test your information architecture with card sorts. You can do user testing on mock-ups. You can do user testing of an existing product. You can do what's called a cognitive walkthrough or a heuristic evaluation of a product. So there's lots of different types of evaluation and testing of an existing product or a mock-up and prototype of a revised or new product. So sometimes when people use the term UX researcher, they're talking about that research during and or after design. So sometimes they're talking about the research before, sometimes they're talking about the research during and after, and sometimes they're talking about both. They're talking about doing any type of UX work, no matter when it is in the process. So it's important to clarify, for instance, if you're looking at a particular job and they say UX researcher, what do they mean by that? Which types of research are they talking about doing? Everything, or just separating the role into kind of before versus during and after? So that's another role, is UX researcher. Now, we also then have UX designer. And lest you think that should be obvious what that means, it's not obvious what it means, and there's terminology differences here as well. So sometimes it's just called, user experience designer. And what they mean is the person who designs what that interface looks like, who designs the screens and pages and the navigation and all of that. But not always. Sometimes people use the term UI design. You may have seen that term, UI design. They're not saying UX design. They're not saying user experience design. They're saying UI design, user interface design. So they may be advertising for a user interface designer, a UI designer. So what is that, and how is that different from a UX designer? Well, some people say that UX refers to this bigger question of design in context, and designing for the right target audience, and doing the user research. And then they get really narrow and say user interface design is the design of that interface. And usually when someone's using the term UI design, they're really getting very narrow. And they're saying this person isn't in charge of figuring out all the flow of the screens. This person is just designing this particular page, this particular form, this particular part of the form. And that's what a UI designer is doing. They're putting the fields on the page. They're putting the button on the page, deciding where it will go and what color it should be. And that is a UI designer. So it's a pretty narrow definition. Now, it's a really important part of UX. When you are designing, and we sometimes call this the micro moment, when you're designing that particular page, screen, form, button, that's really critical part of design. And but that's not all there is, right? Who made the decision to put those fields on that form? Who made the decision that that form should come after this other thing that happened over here? Who made the decision of the overall information architecture structure that gets you to that one page? So sometimes, as I said, people separate and they talk about those bigger decisions as being what the UX, user experience designer, does, and then the smaller decisions being what the UI designer does. Sometimes they're using UI design and UX design to mean the same thing. And this is why it's important to get clarification of whoever you're talking to. If they say this is a user experience design position, you need to dig and find out what do they mean by that. If they say this is a UI design, you want to find out exactly what they mean by that. I said before that I believe that programming and development is not part of what we're talking about with UX work. And I also said that not everyone agrees with me on this. Sometimes when you see the term UI designer, it implies the ability to do some amount of programming and development as well. And the other thing I want to mention here is the role of a visual designer. So my opinion is that visual design is different. It's obviously important to the user experience. It's a critical role, and I hope that you have a visual designer on your project if you are not one. But many UX people are not visual designers, and so I do not believe that visual design is a UX role. I believe it is a visual design role, and that the visual designer should be part of the team and working with the UX professional or professionals. Not everybody agrees with me on that. So sometimes when you see a UI design or even a UX design position, it's describing what I would consider UX and UI and visual design and programming. And that's why you have to kind of dig in and find out what someone really means when they say UX design or UI design. Another term you may hear is user experience strategy or UX strategy. And there's not agreement on this term either, but typically UX strategy refers to one of a couple of things. It might refer to someone who may or may not do the UX work, but is responsible for planning the UX work. So I might have a large project that my company is doing, a piece of software they're designing or redesigning, and I'm going to have some UX professionals on the project to do some research and do some design and so on. But my role as a UX strategist might be to decide what kinds of UX work are we going to do on this project. We may not have time and budget to do everything in the world, and actually everything might not even be appropriate. So I, as the UX strategist, am going to decide, here's the UX work that we need on this project. And that could very well be part of what's called a UX strategist role. And there's other things that UX strategy work might involve or might include. It might include planning for all the UX work in an organization. It might include working on skills and knowledge of the UX staff. It might include how to promote UX in the organization. So lots of other things that might be involved in UX strategy, but I wanted you to be a little bit familiar with that term as well. And terminology-wise, one more thing I want to talk about is the term user experience and the term usability. And actually, this is going to take us back a little bit in the history of the field. So usually, I would say maybe 3/4 of the time, when we talk about the kind of things, work we've been talking about here, you'll hear the term user experience, but sometimes you'll hear the term usability rather than user experience. And some people use those terms interchangeably. So what's the difference between them? Let's talk a little bit about the history of the term user experience. So user experience, that term has been around, I don't know the exact date it started. I'm going to say sometime probably in the early to mid 2000s. So maybe 2003, 2002, something like that. We started to hear the term user experience. Before that, that term really didn't exist. And what you would hear instead was the term usability. People would say, we're going to do usability work on this project. And the focus was then, and still is a lot these days, was on ease of use, ease of learning. And that's really what usability meant. Now, as we got a little more sophisticated in the work, and as we came to incorporate some of these other ideas that I mentioned in the principles about not only is the product usable, but it's also satisfying, it's also engaging, it also meets the organization's goals, then the term user experience came to kind of replace the term usability. But as I said, a lot of people use those interchangeably. Now, just so you know, history-wise, the term usability goes probably as far back as maybe the mid-1980s. Before that, the term that one might have encountered before that, if one was doing this work back then, was human factors. That's a term that is still used today, and that refers to the science behind understanding about humans, about things like how they see and how they process color and how they think and cognitive psychology and kind of a larger world that many of us, myself included, think is very much a part of user experience design. And we're going to get to that in a minute when we talk about skills and knowledge. But you'll still hear the term human factors, and that was a term that was used a lot in the, let's say, 1980s, 1990s. And to tell you the truth, you can go even earlier than that, and you'll run into the term man-machine interface. But that's not used that often anymore. So just be aware that you might hear that term usability, and you want to delve a little if someone uses that term to find out, are they using that interchangeably with user experience, or do they have a specific definition in mind? A little bit more about terms before we're done with all these different terminology. I want to mention two terms. One is customer experience, and the other is service design, because you may run into these terms. Again, not necessarily standardized. This is my opinion on what these terms mean. So if we talk about, and some people use these terms interchangeably again, if we talk about user experience, the way we've been defining it, and maybe as a typical definition, is it's, again, if you think about, there's that interface layer between the user and a piece of technology, and what we're doing is we're designing the user's experience of that technology product. Now, you could think of it in a larger way, and I often do, and I often talk about it in a larger way. For instance, what if I'm not designing the interaction of a technology product? What if I'm designing the user's experience of visiting a museum? and we're not necessarily talking about technology. So you could talk about user experience in a really broad way. I tend to do that because that's my background. But you could talk about the user experience of a physical space as well as a digital space. You could talk about the user experience of a combination, because these days, right, it's possible for a user to go into a store, look at products on the shelves, bring up an app, see if there's a competitor in the area that has a better price, right? That whole thing, is that the user experience or not? So some people say that whole thing is the user experience. Some people might say, no, the user experience is just the part that involves when they use the app. And otherwise, what we're talking about is the customer experience. So we're talking about a larger level. If I call in and have a conversation with the service rep, and then I go online, right? Because that's what people do. They do these combination of things. We can then talk about designing the customer experience in a bigger way than just designing the interaction of one particular piece of technology. So sometimes the term customer experience, people are using it the same way as user experience, and sometimes they're not. And then the term service design, what is that? Well, again, not always agreement here, but service design usually refers to when you're designing not a product, not a technology device, not a camera, not an app, but perhaps you're designing, for instance, the process of registering to go to college, the process of becoming a student, the process of voting, right? The process of applying for Social Security benefits. So these are services that are being provided, and someone is designing that service process. And so a lot of times they'll use the term service design. So some people think that user experience encompasses all of this, and some people think it's a smaller definition. So again, if you are talking to someone and they're using terms like customer experience, service design, user experience design, you want to dig a little deeper and find out exactly how they're using those terms.